5 wolves pinned the new waitress to the table, laughing, filming, certain no one would dare stop them. But when the room went silent, and the man in the charcoal suit rose from the shadows, their smiles died first. What he did next didn't just save her. It carved a warning into the wood itself, one the whole city still whispers about. If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it. Alright, back to the story. The scent of dark roasted coffee beans and lemon oil wood polish usually made Griffin's Corner feel like a sanctuary. It was the kind of place that existed out of time. A warm, golden-lit refuge tucked away in a district where the streetlights had been shot out years ago and never replaced. Inside, the jazz was soft, the bread was warm, and the outside world, a world of gray concrete and desperate people, felt a million miles away. But tonight, the air felt different. It didn't smell like safety. It smelled like ozone. Sharp and metallic, the way the sky smells right before a storm breaks the levees. Alice Howard stood behind the polished mahogany counter, her fingers white-knuckled around a damp rag. It was only her 5th shift. She was 24, but in the dim amber light, with her dark hair pulled back in a severe, sensible bun, and her modest white blouse buttoned to the collar, she looked younger. She looked like someone trying very hard to be invisible. She kept her eyes on the wood grain she was polishing, avoiding the gaze of the few regulars scattered around the room. She needed this job. She needed the cash tips that didn't go through a payroll system, the kind of money that couldn't be traced by the man she had left 3 cities behind. Every time the heavy brass bell above the door chimed, Alice's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a reflex born of 3 years of walking on eggshells. But when the door swung open at 8:15 p.m., it wasn't her past walking in. It was something arguably more volatile. The door didn't just open, it was thrown back on its hinges, the glass rattling in the frame. The low hum of conversation in the restaurant died instantly. The jazz music seemed to fade into the background, strangled by the sudden intrusion of noise. A pack of 5 men spilled into the room, bringing the cold, wet air of the street with them. They were young, loud, and practically vibrating with an unearned sense of ownership. They didn't look like customers. They looked like conquerors surveying a captured village. Leading them was a man who looked like he had been carved out of steroids and bad intentions. He wore a tight white t-shirt beneath a black vest that strained against a chest built in a prison weight room. His arms were thick, his neck non-existent, and his face wore a perpetual sneer of aggressive amusement. Flanking him were 4 others, a uniform of denim jackets and hooded sweatshirts, their eyes darting around the room, cataloging weaknesses, looking for something to break. Alice felt the old, familiar ice slide down her spine. She knew these men, not by name, but by type. They were the wolves who prowled the district, the ones the local cops ignored because paperwork was tedious and fear was easier to let slide. "Table for 5, the leader bellowed, not asking but announcing. He didn't wait for the host. He simply strutted toward the center of the room, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. The other customers, an elderly couple near the window, a tired man nursing a beer, looked down at their plates. The survival instinct in Griffin's Corner was simple. Don't make eye contact. Alice froze. The host was in the back. The manager was in the office. It was just her. "Hey, sweetheart." The voice cracked like a whip. The leader had spotted her. Alice took a breath, holding it in her lungs like a shield, and stepped out from behind the counter. She grabbed 5 menus, clutching them to her chest. "Right this way," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. She led them to table 12, a large round booth near the center. As they sat, they didn't scoot in. They sprawled. They took up space aggressively, legs spread into the aisle, elbows jutting out. The leader, the one in the vest, looked Alice up and down with a predatory grin that made her skin crawl. "You're new," he said, ignoring the menu she placed in front of him. "I haven't seen you around here." "Pretty little thing like you. Dangerous neighborhood for a pretty thing. Can I get you started with drinks?" Alice asked, her eyes fixed on the notepad in her hand. "I want a beer," one of the denim-clad lackeys shouted, laughing as if he'd said something hilarious. "And I want to know what time you get off." The table erupted in laughter. It was a harsh, jagged sound. Alice felt the heat rising in her cheeks, not embarrassment, but pure, unadulterated fear. "I'll get your drinks," she whispered, turning to leave. She didn't make it 2 steps. A hand, thick and calloused, shot out and clamped around her wrist. Alice gasped, instinctively yanking back. But the grip was iron. The leader held her fast, his smile widening into something cruel. "I wasn't done talking to you, sweetheart. It's rude to walk away. Please let go," Alice said, the panic rising in her throat, choking her. "Or what?" The leader sneered. He stood up, towering over her. "You gonna call the cops? They don't come down here. You gonna call your boyfriend? He ain't here either." The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted from tense to terrifying. The air crackled with the metallic taste of violence. "I said let go!" Alice cried out, her voice breaking. The leader didn't let go. Instead, he pulled. It happened so fast the other customers barely processed the movement. With a violent jerk, the leader spun Alice around and slammed her backward onto the table. The wood groaned under the impact. The air left her lungs in a pained whoosh. Before she could scramble up, he was leaning over her, pinning her shoulders down with his weight. His friends surrounded the table, hooting and cheering, their faces twisted in glee. One of them whipped out a cell phone, the camera flash blinding her. "Look at her," the leader roared, looking at his friends, playing to his audience. "Feisty one! Look at her shake!" Alice lay there, pinned against the hard wood, tears hot and stinging in her eyes. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the man holding her down. She was trapped, surrounded. The smell of the leader's cheap cologne and stale tobacco filled her nose, suffocating her. "Please," she thought, squeezing her eyes shut. "Please, someone help." But in this district, no one helped. That was the rule. Except, there was one person in the room who didn't follow the rules. In the far corner of the restaurant, in a booth bathed in shadow, a man had been sitting alone since 7 p.m. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the building they were standing in. His shirt collar was unbuttoned, revealing tattoos that crept up his neck like dark ivy ink that spoke of a history written in violence. Dennis Griffin had been watching the scene unfold with the stillness of a statue. He hadn't moved when the door slammed. He hadn't flinched when the shouting started. He sat with a cup of espresso, his face an unreadable mask of cold, hard stone. But when the leader slammed Alice onto the table, when the fear in her eyes turned to hopelessness, something behind Dennis's eyes shifted. A switch flipped deep in the circuitry of his morality. The restaurant was filled with the raucous laughter of the bullies, the sound of wolves tearing at a rabbit. They were so loud, so drunk on their own power, that they didn't hear the sound of the chair scraping against the floor in the corner. They didn't see the shadow detach itself from the wall. Dennis Griffin rose. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He adjusted his cufflinks, buttoned his suit jacket, and began to walk toward table 12. His steps were slow, measured, and silent. The bullies were too busy laughing to realize that the temperature in the room had just dropped 20 degrees. They were too busy pinning the new waitress to the table to notice that death was walking across the floorboards to meet them. Dennis Griffin did not perceive the world the way other men did. To the average patron cowering in their booth, the scene unfolding at table 12 was a chaotic blur of noise and fear. It was a terrifying disruption of order. But to Dennis, watching from the shadows of the corner booth, the chaos broke down into a series of cold, mathematical variables. He stared at the espresso cup resting on the table before him. The ceramic was white, pristine, contrasting with the dark liquid inside. He rotated it 2 degrees to the left. Perfect. Then, he looked up. His eyes, the color of wet pavement, swept over the group of men assaulting the waitress. He didn't feel anger. Anger was a hot emotion. It made hands shake and aim falter. Anger was for amateurs. What Dennis felt was a profound, icy disappointment. He analyzed the threat level. Target 1, leader. Left foot turned inward, unbalanced, leaning too far forward, relying on mass, not leverage. Target 2, the holder. Grip on the girl's wrist is tight but sloppy. His center of gravity is high. Targets 3, 4, and 5, distracted. Posturing. Their hands are empty, no prints of weapons beneath the denim. They were not soldiers. They were not professionals. They were scavengers. Hyenas circling a wounded deer, convinced they were lions because they had never met a real one. Dennis hated scavengers. In the world, Dennis controlled the world of shipping docks, silent warehouses, and backroom handshakes. Violence was a currency. You spent it wisely. You used it to enforce order, to protect assets, or to send a message. You never, ever used it on a civilian. And you certainly didn't use it on a woman trying to earn a living. That was the code. It was the only thing separating men like Dennis from animals like them. He watched Alice's face pressed against the varnished wood of the table. He saw the way her eyes scrunched shut, the tears leaking out, the absolute terror of being overpowered by men who viewed her fear as entertainment. It triggered a memory, sharp and jagged, from 20 years ago. A different restaurant. A different woman. The same look of helplessness. Dennis pushed the memory down, locking it behind the steel doors of his mind. He wasn't that scared kid anymore. He stood up. The movement was fluid, effortless. He buttoned his suit jacket, a charcoal Italian cut that cost more than the lead Bullies' car. He adjusted his cuffs, covering the ink that spiraled down his wrists, the markings of the Vori, the old brotherhood. The air in the restaurant seemed to thin as he stepped out of the booth. The other diners, the ones who had been paralyzed by fear, now looked at Dennis. They didn't know his name, not all of them, but they knew what he represented. They saw the way he carried himself. They saw the predatory grace in his stride. A hush fell over the room that had nothing to do with the Bullies, and everything to do with the man approaching them. Dennis walked. Step. The floorboards didn't creak under him. Step. He passed the old couple by the window. The man instinctively pulled his wife closer, sensing a shift in the atmospheric pressure. They were witnessing a shark enter a swimming pool. Step. Dennis's mind was quiet. The noise of the restaurant, the jeers of the Bullies, the whimpering of the girl filtered through a damper. All he heard was his own heartbeat, slow and steady. Thump, 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 thump. He was 10 feet away. The leader of the pack was still leaning over Alice, his back to the room, drunk on his own ego. But the hype man, the stocky one in the oversized hoodie, looked up. He saw Dennis. For a second, the Bully's brain tried to process what he was seeing. He saw a suit. He saw graying hair at the temples. He saw a man in his 40s. He made a fatal miscalculation. He saw a victim. "Hey," the stocky bully barked, stepping into Dennis's path. He puffed out his chest, trying to expand his silhouette. "Get lost, Grandpa. This is a private party." Dennis didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't blink. He simply kept walking, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond the bully's shoulder. "I said beat it!" the bully shouted, louder this time, expecting the volume to do the work. He reached out a hand to shove Dennis back. It was a clumsy, telegraphed move. Dennis didn't break stride. He shifted his weight, a subtle drop of the shoulder, and the bully's hand brushed harmlessly against the wool of his suit jacket. Dennis stepped into the man's personal space too close, uncomfortably close, and continued past him as if he were walking through smoke. The bully stumbled, disoriented by the lack of resistance, turning around to gape at the man who had just ghosted him. Dennis was now at the table. The air smelled of stale beer and cheap fear. He looked down at the scene. The leader still had his hand mashed between Alice's shoulder blades. The girl was shaking, her breathing ragged and shallow. The leader finally sensed the presence looming over him. He paused, slowly turning his head to look up. He found himself staring into eyes that were devoid of humanity. There was no negotiation in Dennis Griffin's gaze. There was no hesitation. There was only a calm, terrifying abyss. The leader sneered, his arrogance overriding his survival instinct. He looked at Dennis's suit, then back at Alice, and laughed a wet, ugly sound. "What do you want?" "Suit," the leader spat, flexing the arm that held Alice down. "You want a turn? Get in line." The table erupted in laughter again, but it was nervous laughter this time. The other boys were looking at Dennis, and they were starting to notice the details the leader missed. The scars on the knuckles, the thickness of the neck, the absolute stillness. Dennis didn't speak. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides. He was perfectly balanced, his weight distributed evenly on both feet. He was ready to move in any direction, at any speed. He looked at the leader's hand, the hand pinning Alice to the table. Then he looked at the leader's face. The silence stretched. It grew tight and brittle, like a wire pulled until it hums. The jazz music had stopped long ago. The kitchen staff had come out to watch, peeking through the porthole windows of the swinging doors. Dennis took one more step, bringing him within striking distance. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't clench his fists. He just let his presence settle over the table like a lead blanket. The leader's smile faltered. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. He looked at his friends for backup, but they were frozen, sensing that the predator in the room had finally arrived. Dennis inhaled slowly through his nose. He was calm. He was decided. The calculation was complete. The variable of mercy had been removed from the equation. The silence that hung over table 12 was heavy enough to crush a man's lungs. The leader of the pack, the one with the steroid-thick neck and the arrogance of a king on a dunghill, stared up at Dennis. He was waiting for the flinch. He was waiting for the stutter, the apology, the inevitable retreat that always came when civilians realized they had stepped into the cage with a wild animal. But the man in the charcoal suit didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stood there, a monolith of calm in a room vibrating with anxiety. Alice, her cheek pressed against the sticky varnish of the table, looked sideways through a veil of tears. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the stranger's shoes, polished black leather, immaculate, shining under the dim lights. They looked out of place here. They looked like they belonged in a boardroom, not a brawl. "Run," she pleaded silently. "Just run. They'll kill you." She tried to make a sound, to warn him, but the leader's hand was still heavy between her shoulder blades, pinning the breath in her throat. "I asked you a question, old man," the leader sneered, his voice loud, performing for his friends. "You deaf? I said get in line or get lost." The other bullies chuckled, but the sound was thin. It lacked the raucous confidence of a minute ago. They were shifting in their seats, their eyes darting from their leader to the stranger. Animals have instincts, and the hair on the back of their necks was standing up. They sensed what the leader was too stupid to see. The predator had changed. Dennis didn't look at the leader's face. He didn't look at the sneering mouth or the clenched fists. His gaze was fixed on a single point, the heavy, calloused hand pressing Alice down. When Dennis finally spoke, the sound didn't carry across the room. It didn't need to. It was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as velvet and cold as liquid nitrogen. "Take your hands off her." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of gravity. The leader blinked. The sheer audacity of the command seemed to short-circuit his brain for a second. He looked around at his crew, a grin stretching across his face, a mask to hide the sudden flicker of uncertainty in his gut. "Excuse me?" The leader laughed, standing up slowly. He took his hand off Alice, but only to puff his chest out, to maximize his height. He was big, tall, broad, and thick with muscle. He towered over most men, but he didn't tower over Dennis Griffin. As the leader straightened to his full height, he found himself eye to level eye with the man in the suit. Alice, suddenly free of the weight, scrambled up into a sitting position. She pulled her knees to her chest, gasping for air, her blouse disheveled. She looked at Dennis, expecting to see fear, expecting to see him backing away now that the giant was standing. Instead, she saw a stillness that terrified her more than the bully's rage. Dennis stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, his posture relaxed, his breathing undetectable. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not a fight. "You got a death wish." "Pops," the leader growled, stepping into Dennis's personal space. He let his spit fly, trying to provoke a reaction. "You think because you're wearing a nice suit, you're safe? This is my town. This is my restaurant. You have 3 seconds, Dennis said. His voice hadn't raised a decibel. "To apologize to the lady and leave." The leader's face turned a mottled shade of red. The disrespect was too much. The humiliation of being talked down to in front of his crew was burning him alive. "Or what?" the leader roared. He shoved Dennis hard in the chest. It was a shove meant to send a man stumbling backward, meant to knock the wind out of him. Dennis didn't move. He didn't stumble. He didn't rock back on his heels. It was like shoving a support column. The leader's arms jarred with the impact, the force reverberating back into his own shoulders. The room went deathly silent. Alice covered her mouth with her hand. The other bullies froze, half risen from their seats. The leader stared at his own hands, then at Dennis, confusion warring with rage. "You think you're tough?" he screamed, desperate to regain control of the narrative. He pulled his fist back, telegraphing a haymaker that would have taken a normal man's head off. "I'm going to break your—" Dennis moved. It wasn't a blur. It wasn't frantic. It was efficient. Before the leader could launch the punch, Dennis's left hand shot out. He didn't block the strike. He intercepted the threat. His fingers, long and deceptively elegant, clamped around the leader's right wrist. The sound of the grip was audible, a slap of skin on skin, followed instantly by the crunch of compression. The leader's eyes bulged. He tried to yank his hand back, but he couldn't. He was tethered. Dennis held him with a grip that felt like a hydraulic press. "One," Dennis whispered. "Let go of me!" the leader shrieked, the bravado evaporating instantly, replaced by the shocking, electric jolt of pain. He swung his other fist wildly. Dennis caught that one too. Now he held the bully by both wrists, arms crossed awkwardly in front of him. Dennis stepped in closer. so close that the leader could see the individual flecks of gray in his steel eyes. "You made a mistake," Dennis said softly. The tone wasn't angry. It was almost educational. "You thought fear was power. You thought because she was smaller than you, she was weak." "Let him go!" one of the other bullies yelled, finally finding his voice, kicking his chair back. Dennis didn't look away from the leader. He tightened his grip. The leader's knees buckled as the pressure on his wrist bones approached the breaking point. A high, keen whine of pain escaped the bully's throat, a sound that shamed him. Alice watched, mesmerized and horrified. She had never seen violence like this. This wasn't the messy, flailing violence of the street. This was control. This was mastery. "Please," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "Sir, don't." Dennis's eyes flicked to her for a split second. The coldness thawed, just for a heartbeat. He saw the terror in her eyes, not for herself anymore, but for what was about to happen. He looked back at the leader, who was now sweating profusely, his face pale. "I gave you a chance to leave," Dennis said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. "You chose to stay." The leader's eyes were wide, pleading, the arrogance extinguished like a candle in a hurricane. He realized, too late, that he wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. Dennis twisted his wrists. The sound was hideous. It wasn't the dull thud of a fist hitting meat, the sound familiar to anyone who grew up in this neighborhood. It was the dry, sharp crack of structural failure, like a dry branch snapping in a winter storm. Dennis twisted his wrists. The leader's right arm rotated past the point where joints are designed to go. The radius bone gave way with a sickening pop that echoed off the high tin ceiling. The scream that followed tore through the restaurant, raw and high-pitched, stripping away every ounce of the leader's masculinity. He dropped to his knees, not out of submission, but because his body simply collapsed under the shock of the pain. Dennis released him, and the man curled into a ball on the floor, clutching his ruined arm, sobbing into the dust. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen in a tableau of horror. The remaining 4 bullies stared at their fallen king, their brains unable to comprehend how the hierarchy had been inverted so violently, so quickly. Then, instinct took over. "Get him!" the stocky hype man roared, his face twisting into a mask of rage. He lunged. It was a wild haymaker swing, fueled by adrenaline and stupidity. Dennis didn't even unclasp his hands. He simply stepped inside the arc of the punch, with a movement almost too fast to track. He drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus. The air left the bully's lungs in an explosive whoosh. As the man doubled over, gasping for oxygen that wouldn't come, Dennis placed a hand on the back of his neck and guided his face downward. Crack. Dennis slammed him face first into the edge of table 12. The bully bounced off the wood and crumpled to the floor, blood streaming from a broken nose, instantly unconscious. 2 down. 3 seconds elapsed. Alice, pressed against the back of the booth, covered her mouth with both hands to stifle a scream. She watched with wide, trembling eyes. This wasn't a fight. A fight implied 2 sides struggling for dominance. This was an execution. It was a demolition. The 2 denim-clad lackeys hesitated. They looked at the carnage on the floor, the leader sobbing, the hype man out cold, and then at the man in the suit, who hadn't even broken a sweat. But fear makes men do foolish things. "You're dead," one of them yelled, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The click of the blade locking into place was loud in the silence. The patrons gasped. A knife changed the geometry of everything. Dennis looked at the blade. His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked bored. "Poor choice," Dennis murmured. The knifeman slashed outward. Dennis pivoted on his heel, the blade slicing harmlessly through the air inches from his chest. As the attacker overcommitted, Dennis caught the wrist holding the knife. He didn't twist it this time. He simply squeezed hard, striking a nerve cluster. The knife clattered to the floor. In one fluid motion, Dennis swept the man's legs out from under him. The bully hit the floorboards hard, the wind knocked out of him. Before he could scramble up, Dennis drove the heel of his polished shoe into the man's thigh, just above the knee. The muscle spasmed into uselessness. The man stayed down, groaning. The last bully, the youngest of the group, stood alone. He looked at his fallen friends. He looked at the knife on the floor. He looked at Dennis. Dennis straightened his jacket. He smoothed a wrinkle on his lapel. Then he looked at the last boy. "Do you want to join them?" Dennis asked. His voice was calm, conversational, as if he were asking if the boy wanted sugar in his coffee. The boy shook his head frantically, terrified, backing away until he hit a chair and nearly fell over. "Then sit down," Dennis commanded. "And stay quiet." The boy dropped into the nearest chair, shaking uncontrollably, putting his hands on his head in surrender. It was over. Less than 30 seconds had passed since the first bone snapped. The silence that returned to Griffin's corner was profound. It was the silence of a vacuum. The kitchen staff peered out, mouths agape. The elderly couple by the window was staring at Dennis as if he were a mythological creature that had just materialized in their midst. Dennis didn't look at them. He turned slowly toward the booth. Alice was still huddled in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes locked on him. She was trembling violently, the adrenaline dump leaving her shivering. She looked at Dennis with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. She had just seen him dismantle 4 men with the efficiency of a machine. She wondered if she was next. Dennis's demeanor changed instantly. The cold, steel mask dissolved. The shoulders softened. He stepped toward her, but he stopped a respectful distance away, giving her space. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was gentle. It was the voice of a father checking for monsters under the bed. The contrast between the violence he had just inflicted and the tenderness in his tone was staggering. Alice couldn't find her voice. She shook her head mutely, tears spilling over her lashes. Dennis reached into his pocket. Alice flinched, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a pristine, white handkerchief. He offered it to her. "Take a breath," he said softly. "It's over. You're safe now." Alice reached out with a shaking hand and took the cloth. It smelled of expensive cologne and starch. She pressed it to her face, inhaling the scent, trying to ground herself. "Who?" she choked out, lowering the handkerchief. "Who are you?" Dennis didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the leader of the bullies, who was still whimpering on the floor, clutching his broken arm. Then he looked back at Alice. "Just a customer," he said. But before Alice could ask anything else, the sound of sirens cut through the night air. Blue and red lights flashed against the rain-streaked windows, painting the room in chaotic bursts of color. The youngest bully, the one sitting in the chair, looked up with a glimmer of hope. He had texted 911 the moment the leader went down. He thought the cavalry was arriving. He didn't realize that for men like Dennis Griffin, the police weren't a threat. They were an inconvenience. Dennis heard the sirens and didn't even look at the door. He kept his eyes on Alice. "Can you stand?" he asked, extending a hand to help her up. Alice looked at his hand, the hand that had just snapped a man's arm like a twig. Then she looked at his face. She saw no malice there, only a strange, sad protectiveness. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. His grip was warm, firm, and incredibly gentle. As he pulled her up from the table where she had been pinned, Alice realized that the nightmare was over. But a new story, one far more dangerous and complicated, was just beginning. The arrival of the police did not bring order. It brought a strange, bureaucratic theater that Alice didn't understand. 2 uniformed officers stormed in, hands near their holsters, scanning the room for the threat. The youngest bully, the one trembling in the chair, leaped up, pointing a shaking finger at Dennis. He's crazy. He broke Jake's arm. He's a psycho." The officers followed the finger. They looked at the carnage on the floor, Jake groaning over his shattered radius, the hype man bleeding onto the hardwood. Then, their gaze lifted to the man standing calmly in the charcoal suit. Alice expected handcuffs. She expected shouting. She expected Dennis to be slammed against the wall just as she had been. Instead, the lead officer lowered his hand from his weapon. His posture shifted from aggression to a nervous, deferential stiffness. "Mr. Griffin," the officer said, nodding once. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of hierarchy. "We got a call about a disturbance." Dennis didn't look at the officer. He was busy checking his cufflink. "No disturbance, officer. Just some boys who had too much to drink and fell down. Clumsy," the bully sputtered. "Fell down?" He snapped my arm. "Look at it." The officer looked at the boy, his expression hardening. "If Mr. Griffin says you fell, son, you probably tripped. Now, do you want an ambulance? Or do you want me to run your IDs and see how many outstanding warrants I find?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Alice watched, wide-eyed. In that moment, she realized the man who had saved her wasn't just a strong stranger. He was something much heavier. He was the gravity in the room. The bullies were shuffled out, broken and cursing, loaded into an ambulance that arrived with no sirens. Dennis stayed. He left 10 minutes later, leaving a stack of crisp bills on the counter to cover the damages, and a generous tip for the staff he hadn't spoken to. He didn't say goodbye to Alice. He just gave her a single, curt nod and walked out into the rain. By the next morning, the story had moved faster than the sunrise. In the district, news didn't travel by newsfeed. It traveled by whispers. It moved through the laundromats, the corner stores, and the barber shops. By the time Alice walked to work the next day, the air around her felt different. She kept her head down, clutching her purse, anticipating the usual catcalls or indifferent stares. But they didn't come. A group of teenagers hanging out by the subway entrance stopped talking as she passed. They watched her, not with hunger, but with wide-eyed curiosity. "That's her," she heard one whisper. "The waitress." "Yeah," the one Griffin claimed. Claimed. The word made Alice shiver. It sounded possessive. It sounded permanent. When she arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere was even stranger. The manager, a sweaty, anxious man named Miller, who usually barked at her for moving too slow, greeted her at the door with a fresh cup of tea. "Take your time getting set up, Alice," Miller said, wringing his hands. "No rush. How are you feeling? Did you sleep okay?" Alice blinked, confused. "I'm fine, Mr. Miller. I can work." Of course, just take it easy." The other waitstaff, two girls who had watched Alice get pinned to the table without lifting a finger, avoided her gaze. They cleaned around her with frantic energy, guilt radiating off them like heat waves. They treated her like she was made of glass, or perhaps like she was a bomb that might go off if jostled. Alice hated it. She didn't want to be special. She wanted to be invisible. Invisibility was safety. Attention was danger. That evening, the restaurant was busier than usual. People were coming in just to look. They glanced at table 12, which remained empty, as if it were a shrine, and then they glanced at Alice. At 7 p.m., the door opened. The chatter didn't stop this time, but it dipped in volume. Dennis Griffin walked in. He looked exactly the same as the night before. Immaculate suit, unreadable expression, dangerous grace. He didn't look around. He went straight to his booth in the corner, sat down, and opened a newspaper. Alice's heart jumped into her throat. Her hands shook as she grabbed the coffee pot. She knew she shouldn't go over there. She knew he probably wanted to be left alone, but the debt she owed him felt like a stone in her chest. She walked to his table. "Mr. Griffin?" Dennis lowered the paper. His eyes were steel gray, devoid of warmth but not unkind. "Coffee. Black, please." Alice poured the coffee. Her hand trembled, rattling the spout against the ceramic cup. Dennis watched the tremor, saying nothing. "I wanted to thank you," Alice whispered, clutching the pot to her chest. "For last night. No one has ever done anything like that for me." Dennis took a sip of the coffee. He didn't smile. "You didn't deserve what was happening to you. But you didn't have to help?" Alice pressed. "You could have gotten hurt. They had a knife." Dennis almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "They were children playing with toys. You don't need to thank me for taking out the trash, Alice." He used her name. He knew her name. "Everyone is looking at me," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "They're saying things. They're saying I'm claimed." Dennis set the cup down. For the first time, he looked at her fully, his gaze piercing through her defenses. "In this city," Dennis said, his voice low, "reputation is the only shield that works. Let them talk. As long as they think you belong to me, they won't touch you." "But I don't belong to you," Alice said, a spark of her old defiance flaring up. Dennis looked at her, and for a second, the mask slipped. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 sins. "You're right," he said softly. "You don't, but they don't know that. And for your sake, let's keep it that way." He raised the newspaper again, effectively ending the conversation. Alice walked back to the counter, her mind racing. She felt safer, yes. But she also felt trapped in a new way. She had traded the chaos of the bullies for the shadow of a monster who protected her, but a monster nonetheless. Across town, in the sterile white light of an emergency room, Jake Larson sat on a gurney. His arm was in a heavy plaster cast, elevated in a sling. His face was swollen, his ego bruised beyond repair. The police had released him with a warning because even the cops knew better than to file charges against someone Dennis Griffin had disciplined. Jake stared at the wall, his eyes burning with a feverish hatred. He wasn't thinking about the pain. He was thinking about the humiliation. He was thinking about how the waitress had looked at him with pity. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his cousin, a low-level enforcer for a rival gang. "Heard you got dropped by Griffin? You gonna let that slide?" Jake typed back with his good hand, his fingers stabbing the screen. "Not in this lifetime." He looked at his cast. Dennis Griffin thought he had ended it. He thought he had taught them a lesson, but all he had done was start a war, and Alice Howard was going to be the battlefield. The rain had turned into a relentless drumming rhythm against the plate glass windows of Griffin's Corner. It was 10:30 p.m. The closed sign had been flipped for an hour. The jazz music had been silenced, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator compressors and the sound of the storm outside. Mr. Miller had retreated to the back office to count the till, leaving Alice to wipe down the tables in the dim amber light. She moved mechanically. Spray, wipe, spray, wipe. She was trying to scrub away the memory of the night before, trying to erase the ghost of her own reflection pinned to the wood. But the harder she scrubbed, the clearer the image became. She wasn't alone. Dennis Griffin was still sitting in the corner booth. He hadn't moved in 2 hours. He had nursed a single glass of bourbon, staring out at the rain-slicked street like a sentinel on watch. He hadn't spoken, but his presence filled the room, a heavy, anchoring weight that kept the world from spinning off its axis. Alice finished the table next to his. She hesitated, the rag bunched in her hand. The question had been burning in her throat all day, a bitter pill she couldn't swallow. "Why do you stay?" she asked. Her voice was small in the empty room. Dennis didn't look away from the window. "The rain helps me think." "No," Alice said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I mean, why are you still here? You protected me. You made your point. Why are you sitting in the dark with a waitress no one cares about?" Dennis turned his head slowly. The shadows cut across his face, highlighting the sharp angle of his jaw and the weariness in his eyes. "I care about order, Alice, and right now the order in this neighborhood is fragile." Alice gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles turned white. "I froze," she blurted out. The confession hung in the air between them. Dennis raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Last night," Alice continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "When they grabbed me, when they pinned me down. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I just turned off. I let them do it." She looked down at her hands, which were red from the cleaning solution. "You must think I'm pathetic." Dennis took a slow sip of his bourbon. He set the glass down with a soft clink. "I think you're alive," he said calmly. "There are 3 reactions to danger, Alice. Fight, flight, and freeze. The third one isn't cowardice. It's camouflage. It's the body playing dead so the predator loses interest." "It wasn't camouflage," Alice whispered, her voice cracking. "It was habit." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The silence of the room seemed to invite the truth, to pull the secrets out of her that she had carried across state lines. "My father," she said, the word tasting like ash. "He didn't like noise. He didn't like backtalk. If I dropped a plate, if I laughed too loud, the belt came off." Dennis didn't move. He didn't offer platitudes. He just listened with that terrifying, absolute focus. "I learned early that if I went stiff, if I didn't make a sound, it would be over faster," Alice said, staring past Dennis into the dark. "If I cried, he hit harder. If I fought, he broke things. So I learned to disappear. I learned to be a ghost in my own house." She took a shaky breath. "Then I met him, my ex. I thought he was different. He wasn't. He just had a different way of demanding silence. He liked to corner me. He liked to hold me down just to see the fear in my eyes. He told me that my voice was annoying, that my opinions were wrong, that I was lucky he put up with me." She looked at Dennis, shame burning her cheeks. "So when those boys grabbed me, my brain didn't see strangers. It saw them. It saw the men who taught me that fighting back only makes it hurt more. That's why I froze. I wasn't waiting for you to save me. I was waiting for them to finish." The silence stretched out, heavy and aching. Alice waited for the judgment. She waited for him to tell her she was broken, that she was damaged goods. Dennis shifted in the booth. He leaned forward, the leather creaking softly. He placed his hands on the table, clasping them together. The tattoos on his wrists, symbols of a violent life, were stark against his white cuffs. "Look at me," he said. Alice lifted her eyes. "You survived," Dennis said. His voice was devoid of pity, stripped of any condescending comfort. It was hard and true, like granite. "You survived a father who wanted to break you. You survived a man who wanted to own you. And you survived 5 wolves who wanted to humiliate you." He gestured to the empty restaurant. "You are standing here. You are working. You are breathing. That is not weakness, Alice. That is endurance. And endurance is the hardest thing in the world." Alice felt a lump rise in her throat, hot and painful. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt seen. "I don't know how to be anything else," she whispered. You don't fight with your fists? Dennis said. You fought by leaving. You fought by coming to this city, by getting this job, by standing up every morning when gravity wanted to pull you down. That takes more courage than breaking a man's arm. He finished his drink and stood up. He buttoned his jacket, the mask of the Mafia boss sliding back into place, but the eyes remained human. Trauma leaves scars, Dennis said quietly, almost to himself. It rewires the machine. It tells you that safety is a lie, but you aren't that little girl anymore, and you aren't that girlfriend anymore. He walked past her toward the door. As he passed, he paused, standing close enough that she could smell the rain and expensive tobacco on his coat. You don't have to freeze anymore, Alice, he said low. Because now, you're not the only one standing in the room. He pushed the door open and walked out into the storm. Alice stood alone in the center of the restaurant. She looked at her hands. They were still shaking, but for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was from the adrenaline of being understood. She wasn't just the waitress who got pinned to the table. She was the woman who survived it. And as she locked the door that night, turning the deadbolt with a solid thud, she realized that the metallic taste of danger in the air had changed. It no longer smelled like a threat. It smelled like protection. But neither of them knew that across the city, in a smoky basement filled with men who made their living on violence, Jake's cousin was loading a magazine into a pistol, preparing to test just how strong that protection really was. Peace in the district was a fragile thing, usually lasting only as long as it took for a bruised ego to heal or a weapon to be reloaded. 3 nights had passed since the incident. To the casual observer, Griffin's Corner had returned to normal. The jazz was playing, the coffee was brewing, and the rain continued to wash the grime off the streets. But Alice felt the tension vibrating in the floorboards. She felt it in the way Mr. Miller locked the back door twice. She felt it in the way the regular customers left 10 minutes earlier than usual, sensing a shift in the barometric pressure of the neighborhood. Dennis Griffin had not come in tonight. His absence felt louder than his presence. Alice tried to tell herself she didn't need him sitting in the corner to feel safe, that the conversation they'd had about survival was enough. But as she wiped down the last table at 11 p.m., the silence of the empty restaurant pressed against her eardrums like deep water. She clocked out, grabbed her coat, and headed for the rear exit. The alleyway was a shortcut to the subway, a narrow throat of brick and shadow that she usually hurried through. Tonight, however, the shadows were waiting. Alice pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped into the cool, damp air. She took 2 steps before the sound of a car engine turning over froze her in place. Headlights flared to life at the end of the alley, blinding white beams cutting through the darkness. The car, a battered black sedan, didn't move. It just idled, a mechanical growl that echoed off the wet brick walls. Alice's breath hitched. She took a step back toward the restaurant door, but it had already clicked shut. Locked from the inside. The car doors opened. 4 men stepped out. Alice recognized the silhouette of the one in the passenger seat. Immediately, the bulky, awkward shape of an arm in a sling. It was Jake, the leader Dennis had broken, but he wasn't leading tonight. He was hanging back, pale and vengeful. The man leading them was older, harder. He wore a leather jacket and carried a heavy tire iron loosely in his right hand. This was the cousin. The escalation. You think you're special, don't you? The cousin called out. His voice was gravel and smoke. He walked slowly down the alley, the metal of the tire iron scraping against the brick wall, sending sparks showering onto the wet pavement. Alice pressed her back against the steel door. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. Fight, flight, freeze. She couldn't fly. She couldn't fight. Jake tells me you got friends, the cousin sneered, stopping 10 feet away. The other 2 men fanned out, blocking the escape route. He tells me some suit thinks he runs this block. Well, the suit ain't here, sweetheart, it's just us. Jake stepped into the light, his eyes burning with a feverish mix of pain and hate. Broke my arm, he spat. We're going to break everything in that restaurant, and then we're going to break you. Alice trembled, but she remembered Dennis's voice. You aren't that little girl anymore. She lifted her chin, terrified but defiant. He'll know, she said. If you touch me, he'll know. The cousin laughed. Let him know. We want him to know. He raised the tire iron. Grab her. The 2 men lunged forward. Alice squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. But the impact never came. Instead, the alleyway suddenly flooded with light not from the car, but from the rooftops. High-powered floodlights snapped on, bathing the alley in a blinding, surgical white glare. The cousin flinched, shielding his eyes. What the? Drop it. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. From the shadows behind the dumpster, from the fire escape above, and from the mouth of the alley behind the sedan, figures emerged. They didn't move like street brawlers. They moved like wraiths. 6 men. All dressed in dark suits, all silent, all heavily tattooed. They held no weapons that Alice could see, but the way they stood suggested they didn't need them. This wasn't a gang. This was a standing army. The cousin froze, the tire iron wavering in his hand. He looked around, realizing too late that the alley wasn't a trap for the girl. It was a kill box for him. From the darkness near the restaurant door right beside where Alice stood, a figure stepped into the light. Dennis Griffin. He hadn't been absent. He had been waiting. He wore a long wool coat over his suit, his hands deep in his pockets. He looked at the cousin with an expression of profound boredom. "I expected you yesterday," Dennis said calmly. The cousin swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating as he realized the numbers game had shifted disastrously. This ain't your business, Griffin. This is family stuff. You made it my business when you threatened my staff," Dennis said. "And you made it personal when you came for her in the dark. We're leaving," the cousin stammered, backing up. "Jake, get in the car." "No," Dennis said. "You aren't." He nodded once to his men. The violence that followed was silent and terrifyingly efficient. Griffin's men moved in a synchronized wave. There were no shouts, no chaotic swinging. The 2 men who had tried to grab Alice were on the ground in seconds, zip-tied and gagged before they hit the wet asphalt. The cousin tried to swing the tire iron. One of Griffin's enforcers caught it midair, wrenched it from his grip, and swept his legs out. Jake, the boy with the broken arm, shrieked as he was dragged from the protection of the car. In less than a minute, the alley was secure. The attackers were on their knees in a line, looking up at Dennis. Dennis walked down the line. He stopped in front of the cousin. He didn't yell. He leaned down, his face inches from the man's sweating forehead. "I broke your cousin's arm because he didn't listen," Dennis whispered. "Do you know what I do to men who come back for a second try?" The cousin shook his head, unable to speak. "I end them," Dennis said. "Legally, financially, physically. I will burn your world down until you are begging for a prison cell just to get away from me." He grabbed the cousin by the lapels of his leather jacket and hauled him close. "If you ever go near her again, if you even look at a woman in this district with anything other than respect, I won't just break bones. I will disappear you." He shoved the man back. "Get out of my city." The enforcers cut the zip ties. The bullies didn't run. They scrambled. They fell over themselves to get back into the sedan, tires screeching as they reversed out of the alley, driving as if the devil himself were snapping at their heels. Silence returned to the alley. The floodlights clicked off, leaving only the soft glow of the street lamps. Dennis turned to Alice. She was pressed against the door, eyes wide. She had seen him fight before. But this was different. This was power. This was an empire. Dennis walked over to her. He checked her for injuries with a quick, clinical glance. "I told you," he said softly. "I'm always 3 steps ahead." Alice let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for an hour. "You knew they were coming?" "Men like that are predictable," Dennis said. "Pride makes them stupid." He offered her his arm. It was a gentleman's gesture, contrasting sharply with the tactical takedown that had just occurred. "Come on," he said. "I'll drive you home. It seems the subway isn't safe tonight." As Alice took his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the wool coat, she realized something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She wasn't just under his protection. She was part of his world now, and there was no turning back. The interior of Dennis Griffin's car was a capsule of silence, insulated from the city by heavy glass and German engineering. The rain smeared the neon lights of the passing streets into long, glowing streaks. But inside, the air was still. Alice sat in the passenger seat, watching her hands. They weren't shaking. For the first time in years, the tremors had stopped. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, breaking the silence as they pulled up to her apartment building, a crumbling brick walk-up that looked fragile against the stormy sky. "I know," Dennis replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "But pests don't leave on their own. They have to be removed." "I'm not used to it," she admitted, looking at him. "Feeling protected. It feels dangerous in a different way." Dennis turned to her, the dashboard lights casting shadows across his sharp features. "Safety is a luxury, Alice. Don't apologize for having it." He waited until she was safely inside the lobby before driving away. That night, Alice slept without locking her bedroom door 3 times. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened. In the week that followed the alleyway ambush, the atmosphere at Griffin's Corner shifted. The story of the floodlights and the army had circulated, cementing the restaurant's status as neutral ground. The wolves stayed away. The customers were polite. But the biggest shift wasn't in the neighborhood. It was in Alice. Before, she moved through the restaurant like a shadow, apologizing for taking up space. She walked with her shoulders hunched, eyes down, shrinking away from conflict. But knowing that a man who could dismantle a gang with a whisper was watching her back had a profound effect. It was like a steel spine had been inserted into her posture. It started small. She stopped flinching when dishes clattered. She started making eye contact with customers. She wore her hair down one day, the dark waves framing a face that was no longer trying to hide. Then came the moment of truth. It was a Tuesday lunch rush. The restaurant was packed. A businessman in a cheap suit, red-faced and impatient, was sitting at table 4. He had been snapping his fingers at the staff all afternoon, treating the bussers like furniture. Alice walked past with a tray of drinks for another table. Snap, snap. The sound cut through the noise. The businessman waved his hand dismissively at her. "Hey, sweetheart, coffee, now." The old Alice would have frozen. The old Alice would have rushed over, head bowed, mumbling apologies for a delay that wasn't her fault. The new Alice stopped. She set the tray down on the service counter. She took a breath, feeling the air fill her lungs completely. She turned and walked back to table 4. The restaurant seemed to quiet down, sensing the tension. Dennis was in his corner, as always, watching over the rim of his newspaper. Alice stopped at the table. She didn't smile. She didn't shrink. She looked the man dead in the eye. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Alice. It is written on my name tag." The man blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me? I am not sweetheart," she continued, the tremor in her gut replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "And I am not a dog. You don't snap your fingers at me. If you want coffee, you can ask for it like a gentleman. If you can't do that, you can leave." The man's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He looked around for support, but the other diners were staring at him with judgment. He looked at Alice, expecting her to crack, but she stood her ground, feet planted, chin high. I just wanted a refill," he stammered, his face flushing a deeper red. "I'll get your refill," Alice said, "when you ask nicely." "Please," the man mumbled, looking down at his plate. "Thank you," Alice said. She turned and walked away. She didn't run. She glided. As she passed the corner booth, she didn't look at Dennis, but she saw it a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a ghost of a smile on the lips of the Mafia boss. It was better than applause. That night, after the doors were locked and the chairs were stacked, the silence between them felt different. It was no longer the silence of protector and victim. It was the silence of equals. Alice poured 2 coffees and sat across from him in the booth. It was a bold move, invading his space. But he didn't stop her. "I saw what you did today," Dennis said, stirring his coffee. "I was tired of it," Alice said, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. "I was tired of letting people make me feel small." "You looked tall," Dennis said. "It suits you." Alice traced the rim of her cup. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been haunting her since the first night. "Why me, Dennis?" He stopped stirring. The spoon clinked against the porcelain. "You said you care about order," Alice said. "But you didn't bring an army to the alley for order. You didn't break a man's arm for order. You did it for me. Why?" Dennis looked out the window at the dark street. For a long time, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of a past he rarely visited. "I grew up in a house full of noise," he said softly. "My mother, she was like you. Gentle, quiet. She tried to make herself invisible to keep the peace." Alice watched him, holding her breath. She thought if she was small enough. "The world wouldn't hurt her," Dennis continued, his jaw tightening. "She was wrong. I watched people, men like that businessman, men like those bullies, take pieces of her. Every day, they took her dignity, they took her joy, and I was too young to stop it." He turned his gaze back to Alice. His eyes were open, raw, stripping away the layers of the hardened criminal to reveal the boy who had once been helpless. "I promised myself," he whispered, "that if I ever had the power to stop it, I would. I promised that I would never stand by and watch someone be broken just because they were too good to fight back." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. I didn't help you because you were weak, Alice. I helped you because I've done enough nothing for a lifetime. And when I saw you on that table, I saw her. Alice felt a tear slide down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She understood now. He wasn't just a monster who ruled the city. He was a guardian who was trying to save his own soul. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, Dennis said, his voice returning to its usual steel, though the warmth remained in his eyes. Just promise me one thing. What? Don't ever let anyone make you invisible again. I won't, Alice promised. And in the quiet of the dimly lit restaurant, a bond was forged that went deeper than debt, deeper than protection. It was the bond of two people who had seen the darkness and decided, finally, to light a fire. Legends in this city usually ended in blood. They ended with chalk outlines, police tape, and mothers crying on doorsteps. They were cautionary tales about what happens when you fly too close to the concrete sun. But the legend of Griffin's Corner was different. It didn't end in tragedy. It began with it, and then, miraculously, it twisted into something else, something rare. A promise. Weeks had passed since the night the alleyway was flooded with light. The autumn rain had turned to the biting frost of early winter, but the restaurant was warmer than it had ever been. It wasn't just the heating vents rattling in the ceiling. It was the bodies. Griffin's Corner was packed every night. Word had traveled through the district's nervous system, from the nail salons to the auto shops, from the corner boys to the grandmothers watching from second-story windows. The story had mutated, as stories do. In some versions, Dennis Griffin had fought off 20 men. In others, he hadn't lifted a finger, just stared them into submission. But the core truth remained absolute. The waitress is off limits. The restaurant is sanctuary. Alice moved through the crowded room with a tray balanced on her shoulder. The transformation in the atmosphere was palpable. Before, the air had been thick with the potential for violence, drunk men shouting, wandering hands, the constant need to de-escalate. Now, there was a code. If a voice got too loud, 3 other tables would turn to look. Not with aggression, but with a silent, collective warning. Don't. If a newcomer walked in with too much swagger, puffing his chest out, he would feel the weight of the room press down on him until he either left or sat down quietly. Dennis Griffin didn't even have to stand up anymore. His presence had seeped into the drywall. He was the patron saint of the establishment. Sitting in his corner booth, reading his paper, drinking his black coffee, he was the gargoyle on the cathedral, keeping the demons at bay simply by existing. Alice set a slice of cherry pie down in front of a young woman at table 6. The girl couldn't have been more than 19. She had a bruise fading on her cheekbone, poorly covered by makeup, and she had spent the last hour nursing a tea, looking at the door every time it opened. Alice knew that look. She had worn it for years. On the house, Alice said softly, sliding the pie forward. The girl looked up, startled. I didn't order this. I can't pay for it. I know, Alice said. She touched the girl's shoulder, a bold, grounding gesture. You're safe here. Stay as long as you need. The girl's eyes darted to the corner booth, where Dennis sat. Is it true? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the jazz. About him? About what he did for you? Alice looked at Dennis. He wasn't looking at them, but she knew he was listening. He heard everything. Yes, Alice said, her voice steady. It's true. The girl let out a breath that seemed to deflate her entire posture. She slumped into the booth, the tension leaving her shoulders for the first time since she walked in. She picked up her fork. Thank you, she choked out. Alice walked away, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a beacon. Women came to the restaurant specifically because they knew the rules. They knew that in a city that treated them like prey, this was the one place where the wolves weren't allowed to hunt. It wasn't just the women, either. Later that night, a group of local laborers came in, men with calloused hands and dust on their boots. They were rough men from a rough neighborhood, the kind who usually kept their heads down and minded their own business. As they paid their bill, one of them, a massive older man with gray stubble, nodded at Alice. You tell Mr. Griffin, the man rumbled, that the block is quiet. No dealers on the corner tonight. No trouble. I'll tell him, Alice said. You tell him we appreciate the peace. Alice relayed the message when she refilled Dennis's coffee later. Dennis didn't smile, but the lines around his eyes seemed to soften. Peace is bad for business in my line of work, he murmured dryly. Maybe you're in the wrong line of work, Alice countered, pouring the dark liquid. Dennis looked up at her. The dynamic between them had settled into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm. They were partners in this strange ecosystem they had created. "I am what I am, Alice," he said. "I'm not a hero. I'm a man who breaks things for a living." "You built this," Alice said, gesturing to the room, to the girl eating pie, to the laborers laughing quietly, to the elderly couple holding hands by the window. "This isn't broken." Dennis looked around the room. He saw what she saw. He saw a pocket of order in a chaotic world. He saw people who weren't looking over their shoulders. For a man who had spent his life dealing in fear, seeing the absence of it was a strange sensation. "It's fragile," Dennis warned. "All it takes is one person to forget the rules. Then we remind them," Alice said. She wasn't asking him to do it alone anymore. She was standing with him. The city outside continued to churn. Police sirens wailed in the distance, a reminder that the world hadn't changed, only this small corner of it had. But for the people inside, that was enough. Alice Howard had gone from a victim pinned to a table to a symbol of what happens when someone finally says no. And Dennis Griffin had gone from a mafia boss to a legend, a warning whispered to every bully in the district. "Don't touch her. Don't touch anyone in there, or the devil comes out of the corner." As Alice walked back to the kitchen, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. She stood tall. She looked strong. She realized then that the bruises on her soul had finally started to fade, replaced by something tougher. Something permanent. She was no longer the girl who froze. She was the girl who stood in the eye of the storm and found it quiet. Time moves differently in places that have seen violence. In most of the city, the weeks blurred into months, winter thawing into a wet, gray spring. But inside Griffin's corner, time seemed to orbit around a single, fixed point. It was late. The neon sign in the window had been clicked off, leaving the restaurant bathed in the silver glow of the street lamps outside. The chairs were stacked on the tables, all except two. Alice moved through the room with the easy, fluid grace of someone who owned the space she occupied. She wasn't rushing to leave. She wasn't checking the locks every 30 seconds. She was simply wiping down the counter, the rhythmic swish-swish of the cloth the only sound in the room. She reached table 12. She stopped. The table was clean. The wood was polished to a high sheen, smelling of lemon and beeswax. But right in the center, near the edge, there was a flaw. It was a deep, jagged depression in the solid oak, a dent. It was the exact spot where Dennis had slammed the bully's face into the wood. It was the exact spot where Alice had been pinned, breathless and terrified, thinking her life was over. Mr. Miller had tried to have it sanded out 3 times. He had offered to buy a new table. He said it was unsightly, a blemish that ruined the aesthetic of the restaurant. Dennis had told him, in a voice that brooked no argument, to leave it alone. Alice ran her fingers over the dent. It was smooth now, worn down by months of cleaning, but the shape remained. It felt like a scar. And like all scars, it was a map of where pain had been met with survival. "You're thinking about it again." The voice came from the shadows of the corner booth. Alice didn't jump. She didn't flinch. She just smiled, a small, private thing, and turned to face him. Dennis was standing now, buttoning his charcoal overcoat. He looked the same as he always did, immaculate, dangerous, composed. But the hardness around his mouth had eased. The tension that used to radiate off him like heat from an engine had cooled. "Miller asked me again today if he could replace the table," Alice said, leaning against the booth. "He says customers ask about it." "Let them ask," Dennis said, walking over to her. He stopped at the table, looking down at the mark. "It's good for them to wonder." "He says it's ugly," Alice countered playfully. "It's honest," Dennis corrected. "Most places try to paint over the cracks. They try to pretend the bad things never happened, but the wood remembers." He traced the edge of the table with his eyes. "That mark isn't there to remind you of what they did to you." "Alice." "No?" Alice asked softly. "What is it for?" Dennis looked up, his steel-gray eyes locking onto hers. "It's there to remind everyone else what happens when they cross the line." Alice looked back at the dent. For a moment, the memory of that night washed over her, the smell of stale beer, the crushing weight of the leader's hand, the sheer hopelessness. But it didn't paralyze her anymore. It was just a story, a ghost that had lost its ability to haunt. She looked at Dennis. He had saved her life that night, yes. But in the months since, he had done something far more important. He had helped her save herself. He had given her the space to regrow her spine, to find her voice, to realize that she didn't have to be a victim of her own history. "I used to hate this table," Alice admitted. I used to walk the long way around the room just to avoid looking at it. I thought it was a monument to my weakness. And now? Dennis asked. Alice placed her hand flat over the dent, covering it. Now, it feels like an anchor. It reminds me that the worst thing happened, and I'm still standing. Dennis nodded slowly. A quiet pride shone in his eyes, not the pride of a creator, but the pride of a witness. He had watched her crawl out of the wreckage and build a fortress. You're not just standing, Alice, he said. You're leading. He checked his watch, a reflex of a man who lived by strict schedules, but he made no move to the door. It's late, he said. The streets are quiet. I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, Alice said, and she meant it. I know, Dennis replied, but I'll walk you out anyway. Old habits? Professional courtesy. They walked to the door together. Alice flipped the deadbolt, the sound echoing with a solid final thud. They stepped out into the cool night air. The city was asleep, or as asleep as this district ever got. A siren wailed a few blocks over, but it sounded distant, irrelevant. Dennis walked her to the corner, where he usually turned left toward his car, and she turned right toward her apartment. They stopped under the flickering street lamp. Dennis, Alice said. He paused. Alice. She wanted to say so much. She wanted to thank him for the 1,000th time. She wanted to ask him if he ever got tired of being the monster who kept the other monsters away. She wanted to know if he had found as much peace in this restaurant as she had, but she realized she didn't need to say any of it. It was all there, in the silence between them. See you tomorrow? She asked. 7 p.m., Dennis said. Black coffee. I'll have the pot ready. He turned to leave, but stopped. He looked back at the restaurant, at the dark windows, at the sanctuary they had defended. Then he looked at her one last time. You're safe here, Alice, he said. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder that had passed. As long as that table stands, and as long as I'm breathing, you're safe. I know, she whispered. Dennis turned his collar up against the wind and walked away, disappearing into the shadows from which he had emerged. Alice watched him go until he was just a silhouette against the city lights. Then she turned and looked back at Griffin's corner. Through the glass, she could just barely make out the shape of table 12. The dent was invisible in the dark, but she knew it was there. A scar, a warning, a promise. She smiled, turned on her heel, and walked home. Her footsteps on the pavement were loud, steady, and unafraid. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.